My name is Roxanne Kogel. I'm Executive Director of the Epilepsy Foundation of Iowa. I've been in this role for 10 years, helping individuals and families navigate resources and doing a lot of education programs throughout the state and helping professionals that work directly with people with epilepsy. And we get quite a few calls because whether if somebody is helping them with employment or transportation or for community type services, when somebody has uncontrolled seizures, it certainly throws a wrench into things. So for about 10 to 15 minutes here, I'm going to talk about the intersection of brain injury and epilepsy, and then provide some tips and resources for employment. And so epilepsy.com is the #1 website in the world to get information on epilepsy. It's authored by medical professionals, and it's authored by the Epilepsy Foundation of America. So just know this is a reputable, credible website to get information. So I'm going to walk you through, again, the link is in the chat box, and for traumatic brain injury and epilepsy. So it's TBI is a common cause of seizures and epilepsy. And many times people know when somebody suffers a traumatic brain injury, they land in the hospital, they often are discharged with anti-seizure medication as a preventative measure because they're at high risk for having seizures. And so when we look at how common TBI is with epilepsy, so when we look at data from the CDC, there's 2.87 million emergency room visits, hospitalizations that occur in a year, in the year 2014. And so it's a lot more common than what people realize. And sometimes when people have seizures, they are mild, other times they're moderate, other times they're severe. Sometimes the seizures can start right away after a brain injury, and other times they can start months or years later from that damaged scar tissue in the brain. And so this website has a lot of great resources for TBI and epilepsy. And so when we look at early seizures that occur after a traumatic brain injury, 1 in 10 people will experience an early seizure after a TBI. And 50% of early seizures occur within the first 24 hours following a TBI. And many times they end up being the generalized tonic-clonic seizures. And what this means is seizures that originate from both sides of the brain. Tonic means stiff and clonic means jerk. So these are the jerking and shaking motions, the convulsive type seizures, the kind that can be pretty scary to witness. About 1 in 10 people will develop status epilepticus in the early period after a TBI. And what status epilepticus, how that is medically defined, is a lengthy seizure that goes on and does not end on its own, or somebody having clusters of seizures, repetitive seizures without returning to baseline. And it used to be medically defined at 30 minutes, but now the medical community has redefined this at 5 minutes. So if somebody is having a lengthy seizure and it's hits the 5-minute mark and it does not end on its own before the 5-minute mark, many physicians consider that status epilepticus, and they may need rescue medication or an IV bolus or something type of treatment to help stop that lengthy seizure or repetitive clusters of seizures that last for 5 minutes. And so that's just a good rule of thumb. And most seizures will run through its course and end on its own in 1 to 3 minutes, in just a few minutes. And that's why the physicians use the 5-minute mark, because it's lasting longer than what it typically would last. And it should have ended already. And so late seizures late seizures are defined as seizures occurring more than a week after a TBI. And many times this occurs when it's been a more serious brain injury, and it could lead to the complication of post-traumatic epilepsy, or PTE. So some of you have probably heard of post-traumatic epilepsy. And what this means is somebody that is at risk for recurrent seizures as a result of the brain injury. And so the statistics is 1 in 50 will have a traumatic brain injury that will go on to develop post-traumatic epilepsy. And the spectrum of severity, it varies from where the seizures are well controlled to resistant to treatment, which is considered uncontrolled or refractory to treatment. So when we look at types of seizures that people have with post-traumatic epilepsy, it's about 8 out of 10 people will have focal seizures. And these are seizures that occur or originate in a specific focal area of the brain. The rest of the brain is completely unaffected during that seizure. And part of the reason why the statistic is high for focal seizures is because what we find is that damaged tissue in the brain where that traumatic brain injury occurred, you can usually, see it on imaging, but that's the area of the brain that is where those seizures originate from, is in that focal area, damaged area of the brain. Here's a really good diagram of focal seizures versus generalized seizures. So generalized seizures means the seizures activity is occurring on both sides of the brain. And focal means it's a specific focal area of the brain. And the reason why it's important for physicians and neurologists to help identify what kind of seizure, it's because anti-seizure medication is the frontline treatment. That's the treatment we have the most data for helping manage seizures. And some medications are FDA approved for managing focal seizures. Other medications are only FDA approved for managing generalized seizures. And if somebody has both kinds of seizures or both types, that could be why they're on more than one kind of epilepsy or seizure medication. So a person is at higher risk for developing post-traumatic epilepsy if they experience early seizures after a traumatic brain injury, if they had bleeding into the brain tissue or bruising at the time of injury, or perhaps if they suffered a skull fracture or something penetrated the brain, trauma such as a bullet or a combat injury, or they have a head injury that has occurred in relation to alcohol use, or surgery needed to remove bleeding such as a hematoma from the brain, or to remove a foreign object to the brain, or to drain fluid, a ventriculostomy of the brain. So or if the EEG has abnormalities which occur early in the post-injury. So an EEG is where they put electrodes on top of the brain and it monitors the brain waves. And this is really important data for physicians to see because they want to see what that brainwave activity is doing. And if somebody is displaying symptoms or episodes or what they think is seizure activity, and they have those electrodes on the head, the majority of the time, the neurologist can tell by looking at the EEG brainwave data if it's epileptic seizure activity or not. And so that is very helpful data. A person is also at higher risk if they're older or if they have a family history of epilepsy. And so this website just continues to go on with diagrams, looking at risk factors, changes in the brain that can cause seizures after a TBI, how seizures are treated. If somebody has failed 2 or 3 seizure medications, then most local neurology clinics tend to refer to a certified level 4 epilepsy center. And we only have one certified level 4 epilepsy center in the state of Iowa, and that's the University of Iowa. At a certified level 4 epilepsy center, there's a team of epileptologists. Those are neurologists who are board certified in epilepsy. They have epilepsy neurosurgeons. They have epilepsy nurses. They have a lot more testing equipment and treatment options that they can do. And then they can help determine to see if that person is a candidate for other treatment options if the medications do not work. There's also deep brain stimulation is now FDA approved for managing epileptic seizures, as well as RNS stimulation, the VNS stimulation with the vagus nerve stimulator. There's also a lot of great research for dietary therapy regimens under physician-directed care, such as the rigorous ketogenic diet, modified Atkins diet, and the low glycemic diet. We see the modified Atkins diet used more often than the other 2 diets in the adult population to help with seizure management. Surgical treatment, comorbidities. There's just a lot of things, as we know, with people that suffer brain injuries, severe brain injuries, that impact. And seizures, unfortunately, just add another complexity to that issue. So the good thing is about 25 to 40% of people will have remission or no seizure symptoms of their epilepsy with initial treatment, meaning that initial treatment of that medication does a pretty good job of managing those seizures. And then they can, and which is a huge help. Where we get into challenging situations is those situations where the medications don't work and people are having frequent and uncontrolled seizures. So now I'm going to switch screens here. Now that I've talked a lot about brain injury and epilepsy, and I have a few slides here on employment that I would like to show. So when we look at epilepsy with the American for Disabilities Act, so the ADA does not contain a list of medical conditions for disabilities. And said, as we all know, many of you probably know, the ADA has a general definition that a person must meet on a case-by-case basis. So we have a lot of people with epileptic seizures that are not, their seizures are managed. It does not impact their quality of life. They have full, high-functioning careers. And so they do not meet that definition. And there's other people with epileptic seizures that have comorbidities or a severe brain injury, for example, where they do meet the definition with the American for Disabilities Act with their epilepsy, especially if the seizures are uncontrolled. And so we get a lot of calls on employment, supporting people with epilepsy in the workplace. And so sometimes people think because they have epilepsy, they can't work at all. Well, that's a false statement. People with epilepsy can make positive contributions in the workplace, and they can work even if they have uncontrolled seizures. It's something that they need to have a conversation with their physician. They may need accommodations in order for them to execute their job duties. And it could be more challenging. And many times it is more challenging trying to help somebody find a job, but it's not impossible. And so we're also battling the stigma and the discrimination with epilepsy as well. And so we get a lot of questions on, especially when people have uncontrolled epilepsy, as accommodations. And this is just a wonderful resource, the Job Accommodation Network. They have different medical conditions, and they have a series on employees with epilepsy. And you can go to askjan.org and then type in the medical condition, and it'll pull it up. And it'll list several different types of accommodations. And so what I do is I have people look through there, they discuss it with their physician. They may come across 2 or 3 or 1 or something that may be helpful for them, for their physician to write, an accommodation for their employer. So this is a very helpful resource. We also utilize a lot Disability Rights Iowa. It can help counsel and guide people with employment accommodations as it relates to different medical conditions as well. We do have a lot of resources for employment, and we're happy to be here and be a resource, especially when you're working with consumers in challenging situations. So Diane, I think I hit my 15 minutes. It was a lot of information, but hopefully I hit on some of the key points you were hoping to cover with this group.
Yeah, for sure. Does anybody have any questions for Roxanne? All right, I think that you're good. The website that she pointed out is in the chat. Also want to remind you, I made a list of other resources that we've talked about during this series, and I put all of those in the chat as well. So, all right, get out of your car and go do whatever you're going to do.
All right, well, thank you, Diane.
All right, thanks a lot. All right. So, like I said, we put a bunch of stuff in the chat box. Hold on a second. I think that's her getting out of her car. Maybe not. All right, there we go. All right, so we're going to work on this last session. Again, I highly encourage everyone to go to the session next week, because that's going to be people with the lived experience. So that is very important. I'm going to go back. So we ended last session with some questions that were pretty heavy questions for the last 2 minutes of session, which had to do with accountability. And I just wanted to let everybody know I have had an interesting 2 weeks since that last lesson. I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about how I felt like it was a vocabulary issue, that I was saying the same thing that other people were saying, but the vocabulary was messing us up. And I went to a session, a DEI, a disability, equity and inclusion seminar, where oddly enough, that subject matter came up, and people said that literally what came up in the class was white people see accountability as ownership of process, which is truly what I meant. And this was particularly about, it was about African Americans. And they said, and Black people see it as acceptance of guilt, and there's a punitive process in it. I did not mean the latter. I meant the former. I then went home and talked to my 22-year-old, who sets me straight on all things. And she also said that same thing. Anyway, I did a big deep dive, and basically I think it was that I was using, my vocabulary was archaic. So I'm going to go through it again today. So then I went on, so as I was thinking about all those things and trying to process how maybe the words that I was using were throwing people off, I came across this on Nora Neff Hardy's Facebook page, for the working with brain injury, yoga for working with brain injury, or something like that. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I thought it was kind of apropos for the situation. So forgive yourself for knowing what you did not know before you learned it. I've learned my lesson. I'm just basically not going to use those particular words again. And hopefully be able to get my message out more clearly. That kind of made me laugh, because it meant that I learned something. Life taught me a lesson over the last 2 weeks. And so life teaching me that lesson, one of the things I was going to talk about, kind of in terms of that same conversation, is what a great teacher life is. So this is a saying you guys have probably already always heard, is that life's a great teacher. When you don't learn a lesson, it will repeat it. That is true. However, I also want to say life is such a great teacher that sometimes that emotional memory will kick in, and you're going to remember it forever, whether or not you have a brain injury or not. And that's kind of what I meant by, you're not going to create any kind of consequence for your folks necessarily. You're going to be trying to support them in their employment goal, but natural consequences are going to come along. And sometimes those natural consequences are just literally the only way to learn that lesson. And part of that has to do with the way that our brain works, right? So remember when we talked about the grapefruit and how we file things away in our cerebral cortex? That's where most of our memory is. But then when we have an emotional memory, that's going to dig down deep. That we're going to find that in that like lizard brain way down deep inside. That's how emotional memory works. So people can remember, even the people who don't have very good, what we traditionally think of as long-term or short-term memories, can still emotionally remember something so that action doesn't ever happen again. And I have not found a way that happens other than life. So I'm going to give you guys 2 examples that are kind of similar. Years ago, a long time ago, I started working with a guy who was very inappropriate, said really inappropriate things a lot of the time. he had a job. We worked on it. It seemed like it was better. He was ready. He was, work ready, went to work, got a really good job at working in the tire department of a Walmart. But he made a very inappropriate comment to oh shoot, that's not going to work. He made a very inappropriate comment to a coworker, a little 19-year-old girl who worked at the Subway shop that was there in Walmart. And I mean, there's no getting around it. It was a very inappropriate proposition-y kind of comment, and he got fired. From what we've learned about brain injury, right, you would say, well, he's got an impulse control problem. That's going to be a problem forever. He doesn't use appropriate words, no matter, and I assure you that I had talked to him about these beforehand. But that's just not the case. When he got fired for making that inappropriate comment, he has then never done that again. He went to go work in a warehouse environment, but a warehouse environment where there were plenty of people who he might want to, if he really couldn't control himself, he would have made the same comment too. And it's just never been a problem again. He learned the lesson that time. And so I guess that's just to say, if you find yourself job developing for somebody and something goes wrong, trust life, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Similarly, Bob Brain had not altogether the same situation, but made an inappropriate comment, literally his first day at work. Questionable as far as whether or not it was the same level of not a great comment as the other guy, but he got written up the very first day. And again, based on his impulse control issues, there would be reason to believe that he wasn't going to keep doing it. We really had to work through the fact that he kept saying, now I feel super uncomfortable in my work environment because I'm afraid that I'm going to say something wrong. And we had to talk about, when you're working in a new environment where there's new expectations, you're always going to feel uncomfortable. But that was okay, and worked through it. And he did work through it. He hasn't made any more inappropriate comments at his job. And that was incredibly helpful when we got to, if you guys remember, the chocolate syrup incident, because they were like, well, it was hard for them to see, he had this one big outburst at work. It was hard for the management to be able to visualize that he was never going to do that again. And I was like, no, he learns from mistakes. And if that weren't true, he would still be making inappropriate comments, and he's not. So that shows that he can learn. And sure enough, he's never made any more inappropriate comments. And honestly, we're seeing great improvement in him as far as being able to manage his anxiety, manage his frustrations at work. We're still doing the off-site work on that. So we made, I don't know if you guys can see me, but we made these bracelets this week. It was very frustrating. And he's really learning how to calm down and know when it's time to take a break or ask for help. And you can learn those lessons, but sometimes it really does take having some sort of emotional memory to tell you not to do those things. Back to the guy who was at Walmart. I got a text from him this week because he knew that I was doing these presentations. He said, Diane, I would like to say, live your life. Do not let your brain injury make a new life for you. Carry on doing your usual and bring your brain injury along for the ride. Yesterday, my favorite coworker, Joel, I was working down the aisle and I scanned a part that belonged right beside him, and we were conversing and I forgot something. And I said, that's a symptom of me being mentally disabled. And my favorite coworker responded, I don't believe you're handicapped. I believe you're handy-capable. And it made me subtly proud and internally laugh. And I'm sharing that little story with you guys. This is somebody who people did never think was going to be able to be employable because of his actions. And he is a model employee at this point. It just took some time. So the brain injury bottom line is that it is true. Like I've used this quote before from Maya Angelou. This is the Maya Angelou lesson because we're bringing her up twice in one class. That people will forget what you said and they're going to forget what you did, but they're never going to forget how you made them feel. So every interaction is a chance to be safe, heard, understood, respected, celebrated, hopeful, secure, and empowered. And anything that I said before, this is what it means. It also means making people feel like they're adults, because sometimes we can have a tendency to start talking down to people, and sometimes we need to remind ourselves to talk to people, like grown-ups. And this is just another picture I liked, showing how I talked to Bob Brain this week and said, what are some things that help you get through? And he said, having somebody who reminds me who I was before, and knowing that there's somebody there to support me. A lot of times just reminding people of the skills that they had and they still can tap into, based on their lived experience. And I'm going to go into another little thing about that, the lived experience before their brain injury, but there's also parts of their lived experience as a person with a brain injury that are important to remind people about, right? So I had somebody contact me a couple of weeks ago about somebody who wanted to go into education, and the provider was worried that they weren't going to be able to do what the person thought they were going to be able to do. And it was a funder, and there was just a bunch of questions. And what I like to remind people of when you're working with people with brain injury is not everybody went fully into the hospital and went fully into like acute rehab, but a lot did. And a lot of people that I worked with did. And what you find is you've got somebody who went into the hospital and somebody told them, or told their family probably, that they were never going to be able to breathe again on their own, and they did it. They were never going to be able to eat or walk again on their own, and they did it. So at the point that someone with a brain injury says, I'm going to do this next thing, if you want to be the person that tells that brain injured person that they are not going to be able to do what they think they can do, good luck, because they've been told they weren't going to be able to do a lot of things. And if they're with you talking about going back to work, they've made it pretty darn far. And even if they still are having trouble, even if they still didn't accomplish all of these things, they accomplished a lot. So every person that you work with who has a brain injury, just keep it in mind what an incredible survivor person you've got in front of you, and tap into the fact that you know for sure that you are working with a resilient human being. Which is basically to say, I say all the time, my crystal ball is not grand, it is terrible. And so I don't try to guess. The person should lead the process. Trust them and what they say that they can or cannot do. Work with the family. Believe in them, maybe just one iota more than they believe in themselves at least, which will move you forward. These are so we've been talking about how sometimes people are going to be hit by real life consequences of things that they may or may not have been able to control. And so I wanted to go through some thoughts about how to help them through those experiences. One is you don't want to perpetuate denial. So you want to model acceptance. It is what it is. Like, not it is what it is in a dismissive way, but in a, you've got to be able to recreate the situation for them. So we'll go back to Bob Brain. Because of your brain injury, you have a frustration tolerance problem that resulted in this thing happening. It puts your job at risk, but we're going to put these things in place to try to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And then that's not there's no blame, there's no shame, like, you've got to be able to just say, this is what the situation is, and help them accept that as it is. And then let them miss their own reality. If somebody says, but I used to be able to do this, or I used to be a big deal, or I used to run a whole department, or I used to do this, really the only answer for that is I hear you, and that has to be hard. Anything where you say, but look at what all you, like, it doesn't, like, let them sit in that. That is hard, and they need a minute to sit in that, and just to be acknowledged and to be heard, and to the fact that their lived experience changed overnight, and they need support in that. And then make some space, and then engage them in the solution. So once you've made that space, once you feel like the person's ready to move forward out of that difficult situation, make some space for them and let them engage in the solution. So one way that you can do that, a good way to start that conversation, if somebody's struggling either with a coworker or management or with their own barriers, a good way of approaching the conversation is to say, do you want me to do you want to work through how to work within the current system? In other words, do you want me to be able to tell you what to do to work with the way things are now? Or do you want to work through how to advocate for change within the system? That just kind of opens that conversation up to the full range of possibilities, and gives them a chance to start thinking about how they want to do things. I'm going to give you guys a little secret. Those last two slides I did not get from any disability work I've ever done or any brain injury work I ever done. My husband is a dean at a college, and he works with professors, and he's the one who gave me these ideas, which is just to go to show whether or not you're working with people who have their doctorate and who are teaching college, or you're working with people with brain injury. People are people, and a lot of those same skills are going to apply when you're working with them. This session, I'm mostly saying the things that go on in my head that help me do this work. So I put up this picture for you guys. I'm going to let y'all guess where I grew up. So we're just going to go with when Diane was knee high to a grasshopper. This is where she was. It took me a really long time to figure out what I was good at and what I was not good at. Turned out I wasn't really good at sports that involved a ball. If people throw things at me, I'm probably going to duck. But I was good at swimming. I was good at writing. I was good at a lot of things, and I figured those things out over time. The people that we are working with brain injury have to start this process all over again to some extent, and it varies from person to person. But learning who you are, whether or not that's the new you trying to get to the new normal, or the little tiny Texan that is obviously in these pictures, either way, that is a long and hard process. And thinking of it in this way helps me do the work that I do. I'm sure that a lot of folks came here looking for how to work with people with the hardest to serve people with brain injury, because their problems aren't cognitive or physical, but they have a tendency to be more in the lines of they're more in the lines of, hold on, I messed this up. There we go. Those emotional regulations, people who snap, who yell, who act in a way that is hard for their coworkers, and impulsivity, like the two cases that I talked about before. A lot of this is going to be the same stuff that you guys learned in any other class that you've been in about de-escalation. I'm assuming that anybody's in this class has had enough training that you know to take an individual to a quiet area, or to use mindfulness techniques to ground. Again, you can go back to the Brain Injury Alliance and find those, like, just very basic things. but it's just kind of a reminder to go back to those basic things. There is not a magic bullet for those very hard to work with cases. It is doing, and again, I would go back to, and it's in the chat about how to get to the book about Pearl, but being positive, always positive, being early, really making sure that you know what the antecedent is to the behavior, having a positive outlook on the people that you serve, doing that all the time with all the people, including the hardest to serve and the easiest to serve, everybody all the time. Being reinforcing, looking for opportunities to reinforce, remembering that like all those super basic skills, right? Like you want to be able to provide 3 positive comments before you do anything redirective. And then looking for opportunities to do all those things. I wish there was it, like most things that a lot, or not most, but a lot of the things that we do in life that are hard. It's not that they're complicated. They're like super simple and super difficult to instigate. So just making sure that you do that. And that's why I wanted to give you guys some of these things that I tell myself in my head about what the process looks like and how life can be hard. And a setback isn't always, a setback is sometimes just a stumble. It's not something that's going to take you completely off the path. Because those are the things that keep me going, right? Like I'm telling you, like, this is what, how I reframe my own thinking in order to be able to maintain the most positive, uplifting outlook that I can for the people that I serve. The other thing that I think about a lot is superpowers. And the reason why I think sometimes we'll say we need to work with that person and find their superpower, right? For the person who has deficits. But I'm going to see if I can't. So we've got, see if I can figure out who it is that I'm hearing. But one of the things that I always think about superpowers is that almost every one of the superheroes has some kind of something went wrong, right? Like Batman, it's mostly that he had PTSD, honestly. Spider-Man got bit by a spider. Iron Man wouldn't even be alive if it weren't for the fact that he has that thing in his chest. It's the thing that makes the person, that makes the person's life harder, that can make them have a superpower. And so when you're talking to the people that you're serving, go back and talk about, dude, you are somebody who had a major accident. You learned how to walk. You learned how to talk. You're still showing compassion to your kids. I can go through the people that I'm serving right now, and I can be like, one is tender, one's tenacious. There's something really amazing about each person I'm serving. And some of that they had innately before their brain injury, and some of it that they have because of it. And so try to think about what is it that is causing this person, like this person has something that went wrong and somehow that gave them a superpower. And what is that? Back to some real basics. When we're working with people with brain injury, it's really important to have those long-term supports in place, whether those are the natural supports or whether or not they always know that they can go back to their employment provider in order to get help when they need it. Because any kind of change is going to be hard. People work really well in what they know. And if you change something up, it can affect how they're doing their job or how they're interacting with the people around them. For instance, we know that Bob the barista is going to have additional responsibilities coming up in March. He is going to have, they're going to start doing a grab and go. It's a hotel, so the grab and go breakfast. And so, you know, we're putting things in place that we can be there when that change happens and when there's a new task or when there's a new supervisor. And that's true for all people with disabilities. Anybody who's done this work for a while knows that things can change. Well, in all honesty, all people's jobs can change and get bad. You can have a great supervisor and love your job, and then something can change and your job isn't working out, but we just want to make sure that we're staying in touch, touching base, and asking really good questions like, have you had any trouble with your supervisor lately? Is there anything at your work that's really, what's the best thing about your job right now? What's the worst thing about your job? Because if you just call people and say, how is your job going? They're going to say fine. So we want to ask really specific questions when we're doing those kind of long-term follow-up touch-ins to find out how people are doing. I don't think I covered on this, so I did want to cover on the fact that having substance abuse is a risk. Having substance abuse is a factor for having a traumatic brain injury, and then traumatic brain injury is a risk factor for developing a substance abuse problem. So they've looked at it, and 72% of the people who are in dual treatment for substance abuse and severe mental illness have reported a history of at least one TBI. So if the people that you're serving, this goes back to what we talked a couple of sessions ago when June was talking about screening, we've got to make sure that we're noticing whether or not the problem might be the brain injury. But then again, I want to say, if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. I know all of these statistics. I know how hard it is to recover from substance abuse after you've had a brain injury. And yet I've had a lot of clients who had really significant substance abuse problems, had one brain injury, and were like, that scared the devil out of them. They're done. So, everybody's life is different. The way that everybody goes about things is different. But you do want to always consider, I would say it's more important to consider substance abuse. If somebody has substance abuse, to consider that they might have had a brain injury. Same thing is the statistics are fairly high for domestic violence. When they did a screening of 148 screened, 88 individuals, or 60% of people in a domestic violence center have been screened positively for TBI. We do domestic violence here at CFI. We have a domestic violence center, and I know that they have a lot of concern about hypoxic brain injury or loss of oxygen due to strangulation, because that's become something that they're noticing more in the domestic violence world. And there is a high correlation between incarceration and brain injury. So just making sure that if somebody's been incarcerated, that we're looking back at that brain injury. Another thing I wanted to talk about is just life cycle and how the age that when somebody gets their brain injury can create kind of like why the age of the brain injury makes a difference. So two things that can come up. One is if a child has a brain injury, they may look like they've recovered really well because while they're still a child and like in elementary school, somebody else is acting as their executive function. So somebody else is making sure that they're eating right or that they're doing all the right stuff. And then when they hit teenage years is when you're going to start seeing those you're not going to be able to see the executive function deficit until they need their executive function. In other words, until they're making their own decisions about how they're interacting with the world. I'm not saying altogether, like you can see some things earlier, but it's very common that you're going to start seeing the problems from an early pediatric brain injury around teenagehood when that executive function needs to come on board a little bit more and it's expected to come on board and it's not. The other thing that I've seen a lot of is people who got their brain injury when they were teenagers, and teenagers don't have great executive function. And so I may be working them when they're 50 or 60 years old even, and you're still seeing some of those teenager-like behaviors, which can look very different. Like if somebody does certain things as a 19-year-old, those same things as a 30-year-old or a 50-year-old can look really different to the community around them. So we want to make sure that we're just aware of that what we're looking at now might have something to do with a brain injury that happened in the past, right? So we've talked through everything. I'm hoping that you guys can remember that your explanation should guide your intervention. you're going to see, so trying to learn as much as you can about the person that you've served, when they had their brain injury, how they got their brain injury, where the brain injury was, how that's affecting them. And not assuming that, because I'll get a lot of questions about like, is this malingering or is it their brain injury? There are a couple of people who can usually figure that out. A neuropsychologist can usually figure that out. Mayo has a really good program that part and parcels that out, but like that's not something that I would even know. So I'm always going to assume that the person is doing the best they can with what they have, no matter what the reason, right? Either one of those, they're doing the best they can with what they have. But if your brain injured person seems lazy or resistant or non-compliant, all of those can be initiation problems, problems with executive function, things that have a biological component and we need to dig deep and figure out, like, okay, so let's go back to those basics and figure out how to be dealing with that particular situation. And knowing that can help you have the most positive attitude about how you can possibly help them. These are the comments that my friend Becky, so I told you back at the very beginning that I had a friend named Becky from college who had a brain injury, who made her own slideshow, which is fabulous, about having a brain injury. And these are the things that she said, please don't ever say to me. Others have it worse than you. Going back to that slide where I'm like, let people sit with the fact that they lost something. Or I miss the old Becky. One of the things that takes forefront here is the vegan, macrobiotic, gluten-free, anti-inflammatory diet. Like people who are in these situations are trying everything they can. And if you just have grace with them in the terms that they are doing the best they can and be careful about what you say. These are not my comments. This is what my friend Becky said. Please do not say any of these things to me. And I do want to put a little plug in there for Remember the Families. I've been doing this work for a long time. And being the daughter of somebody with a pretty significant brain injury, my mom had surgery this week, having a little rough go coming out of it. They replaced her shunt, and she is struggling a little bit right now. And I just want to say, when you're working with someone with a brain injury and you get frustrated with their family members, keep in mind that we family members are doing the best we can too. And celebrate yourselves, celebrate your people, celebrate yourself. You guys have hung in here for 4 weeks so far, and I know you're going to attend next week, and celebrate those good moments. There's going to be this is tough work that we do. I'm just hoping that you guys can take a moment and realize that you dedicated yourselves to learning more, being better, doing better. Whether or not you got anything out of this series or not, you dedicated the time to it. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for how much you care.